Imagine a state that once had so much wealth it could have bought its way out of any problem. Now fast forward to today, where that same state is scraping the bottom of the economic barrel. Hard to believe, right? This place was an agricultural titan with rich land and a booming economy. But somehow it's now riddled with high poverty rates, low wages, and an economy stuck in neutral. So how does a state go from being at the top of the heap to barely holding on? It's not just a matter of bad luck. There's a story of missed opportunities and stubborn resistance to change. The state that took this wild ride from riches to rags? Mississippi. Stick around, because today we're unpacking the downfall of this former economic giant. You see, the statistics tell a grim story. Mississippi has the lowest GDP per capita, one of the lowest labor force participation rates, and the highest poverty rate in the US. But those numbers don't just live on paper, they translate to real-life problems. Mississippians have one of the shortest life expectancies in the country as well. Let's explore the history, the natural challenges, and the deeply ingrained cultural attitudes that shaped Mississippi's fate. So, how poor is this state? Well, it's not just the poorest state in America, it's the kind of poor that makes other struggling states like West Virginia seem a sigh of relief. With a GDP per capita of $39,000, Mississippi lags well behind the national average of $81,000. To put that in perspective, even West Virginia, the second lowest, pulls in $45,000 per capita. And in a country as productive as the US, being last place on the economic leaderboard is like being the slowest driver in a Formula One race. Sure, you're still fast by global standards, but you're not keeping up. Mississippi also suffers from one of the lowest labor force participation rates in the nation, meaning fewer people are working or even looking for work. Combine that with the highest poverty rate in the US, and the situation looks grim. About 20% of Mississippians live below the poverty line, which is roughly double the national average. Now let's talk about the real-world impact of these economic struggles. The average Mississippian earns nearly half of what most Americans do, and that lack of income comes with serious consequences. One of the most glaring is, again, life expectancy. The average person in Mississippi lives about 4 years less than the typical American. That's a lot of missed time with family and a lot of opportunities cut short. Mississippi wasn't always the underdog of the US economy. In fact, at one point, it was on top, a shining example of American wealth and prosperity. Back in the early 19th century, Mississippi was an economic powerhouse thanks to one simple but profitable formula: plantation agriculture. Cotton was king, and the state's fertile land, crisscrossed by natural waterways, made it the perfect place to grow and ship massive quantities of the crop. This agricultural bounty wasn't just luck, it was built on the backs of slaves, providing Mississippi with a labor force that didn't need to be paid. With free labor and some of the richest farmland in the country, it's no surprise Mississippi was rolling in wealth. The state was generating serious cash, and it didn't need to invest in much else. Why build factories or railroads when the rivers provided all the transport you needed? Why invest in machinery when cheap labor could do the job? For a long time, Mississippi didn't see the need to diversify its economy or plan for the future. The wealth from cotton plantations was flowing. It must have felt like it would never stop. However, this short-term success had a long-term cost. While other regions in the US began to invest in capital, things like factories, infrastructure, and industry, Mississippi stuck with what worked: agriculture. The state's rich landowners were content to keep things as they were, and they weren't too keen on paying for public goods like roads or schools. After all, most plantation owners lived on self-sufficient estates, so they didn't see much benefit in funding projects that wouldn't directly affect them. This lack of investment in infrastructure and public services would haunt Mississippi for generations to come. To make matters worse, Mississippi's reliance on slave labor created a deep-rooted resistance to change. Slaves were seen as both labor and capital. As long as plantation owners could invest in more human labor, there was no reason to modernize or mechanize. In fact, the idea of capital investment, buying machinery, building roads, or funding public projects, was seen as unnecessary. As long as the cotton kept flowing, there was no need to embrace the wave of industrialization that was sweeping across other parts of the country. Meanwhile, states in the north, and even some in the south, were embracing industrial growth. They built factories, invested in new technology, and diversified their economies, which set them up for long-term success. When the Civil War hit, it didn't just shake Mississippi hard, It completely dismantled its economic foundation. With the abolition of slavery in 1865, that entire system crumbled. Suddenly, the state's most valuable asset, its free labor force, was gone, and the plantation economy that had once made Mississippi rich couldn't survive without it. The state's prosperity evaporated almost overnight, and the fallout wasn't just economic, it was social too. Mississippi wasn't just losing labor, it was losing people. The Civil War decimated the population. Many young men died in battle, others were left injured and unable to work, and the slaves who were freed, finally able to escape the plantations, fled north for better opportunities. The population drain also intensified social divisions. Over half the population were recently freed slaves, left with no land, resources, or guidance on how to survive in a world that had treated them as property. Meanwhile, the white elite who had profited from the old system were left scrambling to figure out how to maintain their wealth and power in a radically changed world. Another thing that made it worse was the state's stubborn refusal to invest in the future. Before the war, plantation owners saw no need to fund infrastructure or education. Why build roads when rivers did the job? Why support schools when private tutors or homeschooling sufficed? This mentality didn't change after the war. Mississippi doubled down on traditional agriculture, resisting change even as the world around it evolved. Underinvestment in infrastructure and education became a long-standing problem, and the state's refusal to modernize meant it was left in the dust. Then there's the matter of wealth recalibration. Before the Civil War, much of Mississippi's wealth was tied to its slave population. In fact, historians estimate that up to half of the state's recorded wealth in the mid-19th century was tied to the value of enslaved people. When slavery was abolished, that wealth didn't just disappear, it was recalculated. Mississippi's economy took a major hit as assets that were once counted in dollars now no longer existed. And unlike other states that could fall back on factories or diversified economies, Mississippi had no backup plan. The state's leaders weren't blind to the opportunities industrialization could bring. Factories, railroads, and new technologies were transforming the economies of both the North and other southern states. Mississippi, however, resisted. One major sticking point was the question of labor. The white elite weren't too keen on seeing black workers in factories. They feared it would upset the delicate social balance that already had been rocked by the abolition of slavery. This opposition to black labor in industrial jobs stunted the growth of factories and infrastructure, leaving Mississippi trapped in the past. Meanwhile, the rest of the country, and even other southern states, was surging ahead. They were building factories, railways, and ports, capitalizing on their geographic location and making themselves more competitive in a rapidly industrializing world. Mississippi, however, remained focused on traditional farming. The state's reluctance to modernize meant that it didn't have the infrastructure or industrial base needed to compete in a post-agrarian economy. And before you even think it was just a missed opportunity, nope, it was a disaster for Mississippi's long-term prospects. By the time the 20th century rolled around, industrialization wasn't just a competitive edge, it was a necessity for survival in the American economy. Yet, Mississippi was still stuck relying on farming, hoping to make do with cotton and other crops. The state's continued focus on agriculture not only limited its economic growth, but also perpetuated a cycle of poverty and underdevelopment. Farms that had once thrived with slave labor now struggled to survive with a paid workforce. Mechanization could have offered some relief, but Mississippi was slow to adopt even that. The resistance to industrial growth kept wages low, opportunities scarce, and the economy stagnant. It also meant that as other states invested in education and infrastructure to support their new industries, Mississippi fell further behind. It resulted in a lag in development, which became more glaring as neighboring states like Florida reaped the benefits of industrialization. Florida embraced its natural advantages and built industries that would sustain it long into the future. By the time Mississippi recognized that it had been left behind, it was too late to catch up. But the state is also constantly at the mercy of natural disasters that make economic recovery feel like trying to run uphill in a mudslide. Flooding, tornadoes, hurricanes, Mississippi has seen it all, and the financial toll is staggering. Billions of dollars that could have been spent on growth and development have instead been funneled into flood protection and disaster recovery. And even with those investments, Mississippi is never really out of the woods. Every few years, a major storm or flood sets the state back again, forcing it to spend more just to stay afloat, sometimes literally. The state's location along the Gulf Coast, with its proximity to rivers like the Mississippi, might have once been an asset for trade, but it's also a prime target for hurricanes and floods. The constant rebuilding effort eats into the state's already thin budget, forcing it to prioritize damage control over innovation or long-term growth. And while natural disasters might explain some of Mississippi's woes, there's another challenge that has held the state back: brain drain. Mississippi has long struggled with a weak education system, and that's a recipe for driving talent out of the state. Many of the state's best and brightest leave to attend universities elsewhere, and once they're gone, they typically don't come back. Why would they, when other states offer better job opportunities, higher wages, and a higher quality of life? This exodus of skilled workers leaves Mississippi with a shrinking talent pool, making it even harder to attract businesses that rely on an educated workforce. Mississippi's education system plays a huge role in this. The lack of emphasis on developing a skilled labor force has had a ripple effect on the state's ability to innovate. Without a strong educational foundation, there's little incentive for major companies to set up shop in Mississippi. Surely, there's no need to build a factory or an office there when other states offer a more qualified workforce and better infrastructure. And the lack of big businesses only perpetuates the cycle. Without those companies, there are fewer job opportunities, and without job opportunities, there's no reason for talented individuals to stick around. The result is a vicious cycle that Mississippi hasn't been able to break out of. Natural disasters knock the state down, and the weak economy, drained of its best talent, doesn't have the resources or innovation to get back up. Other states, even the ones in the South, have managed to create environments that attract businesses and retain talent, but Mississippi remains stuck in the past. Its struggle isn't just about what happened within its borders, it's also about how the world changed around it. For a brief moment, it looked like the state might actually find its footing in the modern economy. As labor costs in other parts of the country rose, Mississippi's cheap workforce made it a low-cost manufacturing hub for U.S. companies. Factories sprung up, and for a while it looked like the state could ride the wave of American manufacturing into a new economic chapter. But then globalization hit, and the ride was over before it even started. Also, the rise of outsourcing was a gut punch to Mississippi's already fragile economy. As companies realized they could move production to countries like China, where labor was cheaper, Mississippi's edge vanished. It's one thing to compete with other U.S. states that have higher wages and more regulations, but it's a whole different ballgame when your competition is halfway around the world and paying a fraction of what you pay. Factories that had once been a lifeline for the state packed up and shipped out, leaving behind empty buildings and unemployed workers. Also, states with big corporate players like Apple, Microsoft, and ExxonMobil were able to use their global reach to create jobs, attract talent, and grow their economies. Mississippi, without any of these big corporate entities, was left watching from the sidelines. The bitter irony is that this state, with all of its geographical advantages, should have been a key player in global trade. It sits on the Gulf of Mexico, with access to major shipping routes that could have turned the state into a hub for international commerce. Yet, despite its location, Mississippi never integrated into the global trade network in any meaningful way. Instead, deep sea ports in neighboring states like Louisiana and Alabama became the go-to spots for shipping traffic, leaving Mississippi with little more than missed opportunities. The state's economic isolation has also led to another problem: heavy reliance on federal funding. The state receives significantly more federal aid than it contributes in taxes. For every dollar Mississippi sends to Washington, it gets more than $1 back in direct federal support. This isn't necessarily unusual for poorer states, but Mississippi's dependence on federal funds is particularly pronounced. Another area where Mississippi leans heavily on federal dollars is in defense contracts. The state doesn't have many Fortune 500 companies, but it does have a surprising presence in military-related industries. Mississippi ranks 5th among U.S. states in defense GDP, which may sound impressive at first glance, but the reality is that the state's economy relies on these contracts to a degree that suggests a lack of broader economic diversity. Political representation plays a significant role in maintaining this support, too. Despite its small population, Mississippi still has 2 senators and a handful of representatives in Washington. However, relying on federal dollars in defense contracts isn't a growth strategy, it's a survival mechanism. Mississippi can't depend on this forever. And that's it for this video. Mississippi's economic struggles stems from a mix of missed industrialization, natural disasters, and reliance on federal aid. But can it turn things around with smart investments in technology and education? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. Thanks for your support.